Hello, welcome to the latest episode of Bogan Intelligentsia. I'm Joel Jenkins, and today we're going to be sitting down with our guest, Jeff Rich, who holds a PhD in history. In today's episode, we will be having a deep dive into multipolarism and what it means for the world and for Australia. And as a part of that, we're going to be looking at some of the examples of multipolarism throughout history, some of the flashpoints of multipolarism in the future as it grates with powers that look to suppress it. And we see how Australia can potentially survive in such a new environment that is seemingly inevitable. Really excited to have Jeff on today, and it's going to be a pretty long episode. So I hope you've got yourself a coffee or a cup of tea, and you enjoy this very informative session. Thank you. Welcome to the program, Jeff Rich. How you doing?
I'm really great, Joel. It's really wonderful to join you.
Well, thanks for being here, and it's really good to have a Substack buddy joining. First, sort of Substack buddy. So, yeah, thanks for coming.
Well, thanks for your support on Substack too. But Joel, I almost called you Bogan.
Well, I'll take Bogan for short. No worries.
Yeah. I'm sort of vibing the intelligentsia look today, but not really the Bogan look. So I hope that's okay.
By virtue of being here, you have been boganized anyway. So yeah, you'll have to scrub the filth off later on if you want, Jeff. But
Yeah.
It looks good on you. So yeah, before we sort of get stuck into the order of proceedings, essentially Jeff is an expert on multipolarism. A dirty word that you might be hearing at the moment that's sort of popping up regarding BRICS. You might have been sort of hearing it around that grouping, economic grouping that's emerging in the world. Firstly, I would actually want to ask you, Jeff, just to explain to the audience, what is multipolarism?
Well, I guess multipolarism is a way of thinking about the world as having many centers and many sources of initiative and many poles of power, and very much it's a contrast to what people got used to, I guess, during the Cold War, which was the bipolar world. And then after 1991, after, what people call the unipolar moment, when America was the sole superpower, the hyperpower of the world, it was a kind of a response to that to say, America's not the be all and end all. It's not the only model in the world, nor the only source of power in the world. And so why don't we create a world in which there's space for other people, other cultures, other political systems, other economies to sort of bloom a little bit. And that's I think that's the sort of sentiment, so to speak, behind multipolarism. And sometimes people get a bit caught up in the intellectual theories about it, and people debate, is it really multipolarism, or is it, multinodals and all these sort of things. But in essence, it's just saying the world's a big, diverse place. There's room for more than one approach to the world, and why don't we make room for that? So I think that's essentially what multipolarism is.
Yeah, right. And with this, it's quite a unique moment we're living in history, a unipolar moment like this. And even the sort of spheres of influence of the bipolar moments before that sort of, dominated the world for most part of a century. Is it the fact that multipolarism was kind of maybe the order of proceedings in times before? Like, people that are born in this day and age may be sort of unfamiliar with this kind of way of doing things, and even people in the strategic space that are thinking about how, I think about Graham Allison and the Thucydides Trap. It's like this inevitability of like great power conflict between emerging powers. But was there a time before, and has there been many epochs in history where multipolarism was the order of proceedings?
Oh, look, absolutely. And I think in a way, a lot of the history, a lot of the international affairs, a lot of the journalism, I guess, also that we get on international affairs today has really been written within the mental horizon of the unipolar moment. And it sort of has looked back at, uh, the post-1945 world through the prism of what the post-1991 world was, and it's sort of forgotten just how conflict-ridden, how chaotic, how different, how diverse, how many contentions there were. And in many ways, I would say, in many ways, the world's actually always been multipolar, even during the bipolar era, even during, the 1990s, the world was still multipolar. During the 1990s, the United States wanted to push down Japan and stop Europe reasserting itself. Europe wanted to come into its own in the 1990s and 2000s. Before the global financial crisis, Nicolas Sarkozy, as the president or prime minister of France, I think it was president of France, was saying, you know, the world's multipolar, we should adjust to the multipolar, by which he meant, America needs to allow Europe to be Europe rather than just be part of the Western alliance. So the usual course of affairs in the world is there are, many powers, many cultures, a lot of diversity, and a lot of argument about what the fair rules are about how states and states interact with each other. So multipolarity is really the standard course of events. Indeed, the Indian External Affairs Minister Dr. S. Jaishankar wrote a book called The India Way not so long ago, where he basically sort of set out the Indian approach to foreign policy, and he said there, the natural state of the world is multipolarity, and he actually made a virtue of the fact that the sort of Indian traditions of statecraft and thinking about politics, which he sort of framed against the great Indian epic, the Mahabharata, uh, uh, just assumes a world of many contending powers rather than a world of good versus evil, which I guess is the Western, European, particularly American sort of way of framing things, democracies versus autocracies and all that sort of stuff, the sort of liberal rules-based order. So I very much see the world as always being multipolar. And in a way, what we're seeing at the moment is um, the sort of mist is clearing around the realities of the world, and we're seeing that China has just had this extraordinary economic rise, and so our conceptualization of what China is needs to be completely different. In a way, India has done the same, if not quite as successfully yet, but in a way, it's actually transforming its role in the world as spectacularly as is, Indonesia. I've heard you talk on the program about Indonesia as well. So it's sort of the realities of the independent, resourceful, creative aspects of all the other countries of the world, apart from, America and the West, is just becoming so clear and so real in terms of the actions people are taking, that it's just impossible to keep up this sort of illusion that there was this US-led multipolar, unipolar, US-led rules-based international order that, peacefully ruled over the world since 1945, and no one ever challenged, and there was never a decolonization movement, and there was, never a Cold War, and there was, within the Cold War, there was never ever any tension between Europe and America. Within the communist world, there was never ever until Henry Kissinger sort of fixed it up, any tension between China and the Soviet Union. There was never a non-aligned movement. There was, all these things which are absolutely essential for understanding the post-1945 world just get sort of scrubbed. There was never, a very strong attempt in Europe to repair relations with Eastern Europe and with Russia in order to have a sort of collective security arrangement that was not so dependent on America. All these things are just sort of kind of forgotten about. But all those issues are still sort of with us, but they've just taken a new form because the relative resources and power and influence of all those different countries, all those different cultures is just so much greater. And so you just can't keep living in a world that assumes that, America is so far above everyone else that it gets to determine the rules of the world.
Yeah, incredible. Like, I wonder if that Francis Fukuyama end of history moment has, sort of addled the brain of decision makers in the West for the, rather short period since. There was only maybe about 8 or 9 years of that, and that was due to a compromised Russia. That was due to a whole bunch of things that were happening at that point. But up until the, global war on terror, that might have been that period where all the Hollywood movies were about, mopping up the last few terrorists in the world as opposed to fighting a great power. I do want to sort of eventually get onto Mackinder's heartland theory that you've discussed, because, I also think that potentially Fukuyama's end of history posit was kind of like something that was, a soft version of what that could be as well. And I know you have a lot of depth around that part of history in the early 20th century. So I'd love to get there. I sort of like want to get first to that boogeyman factor of of multipolarism. We're seeing with BRICS now, there's a added pressure from Washington to kind of contain BRICS. Trump's just recently warned that he's going to slap tariffs on anyone for just engaging with the system, which leaves Australia, in a position ultimately where even just thinking or considering about it, we're seeing what's happening with the PBS and all these sort of things with the tariffs floating around at the moment. We're just going to get slapped on the wrist for even, thinking of that space. I want to ask you, does the West have something it can harken back to be less terrified of multipolarism? I'm talking about maybe the Congress of Vienna and a couple of other moments in history where, or the Treaty of Westphalia, for example, where they put down some, new laws around multipolarism. And I've written recently about, the red wedding diplomacy of the US essentially right now, which is happening where, we're inviting people in for a coffee and we're striking them, under the pretense of diplomacy or peace or ceasefire. So how does the West become less scared of multipolarism and start to think about how it can engage for its own benefit in this new emerging world that can't be stopped?
Well, look, at a very simple level, I mean, I think it's probably good just, it's that old adage that us equals them, and the West is actually not so different to the rest. And I think there's there's a sort of a thought, I guess, to unpack in that. I mean, I should say, I mean, I come to this really having studied history, particularly sort of global history, for most of my life, but also my experience working in government over 30 years or so, and just seeing how people have to kind of there's one thing talking about issues in the political domain, and there's another sort of us versus them kind of politics. And there's another thing of actually working through real problems together. And so ultimately having proper dialogue between countries, between great powers, between different interest groups, between different political parties or whatever, helps you get to a better sort of sense of what the actual problem, what a compromise solution might be together. So when it comes to the West's fear of the rest, as represented by the BRICS and represented by multipolarism, I think to some degree there is a sense in which, well, we've created this identity of the West, but we've actually, when you really look at the history of it, it's actually a bit of an invention. And in fact, there's always been this interpenetration of different cultures and different ideas. The idea of the West as this sort of, Roman, classic Greek heritage that comes through somehow strangely through Britain and then to the United States, and then blooms after 1945 as Western civilization. This is a bit of a narrative that people have told. And a lot of the ideas that are talked about in terms of world order have many cultural origins. And this is the theme of a book by, I can't remember his first name, but it's Acharya. And I have it here somewhere, but I just can't remember what it is. But he basically says what the countries of the world really need to do now is have a mutually respectful dialogue about what is a good sort of world order now, that rather than treating people in these sort of good, bad, democracy, autocracy, West, non-West, BRICS versus G7 type sort of categories, actually sort of deals with the realities of what people are a little bit more respectfully. So I think that's one thing. But I guess the other thing is that it's about recognizing the uniqueness of what's actually happened since 1945. Because, you can't just say, let's respect each other, blah, 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 blah. But the fact is, the United States, since 1945, has expanded to have 800 military bases around the world. It's enforced what historian John Darwin, who I sort of talk about quite a bit on my channel and Substack, who's historian of empires, talks about as the partition of Eurasia. So after 1945, there's the Allied victory. The United States is largely untouched, and it uses its relative position compared to all the other countries that have suffered massive casualties and major damage to their economic infrastructure. It basically sort of enforces a partition in Europe, which is the Iron Curtain, and a partition in East Asia, which is like the dividing line between Korea. It militarily occupies Japan, and it also effectively introduces the partition that happens in Palestine as well. So there's this.
And does the Bretton Woods system tie in, the implementation of Bretton Woods tie in with this stanza as well?
Well, it does. I mean, it's I guess the financial arm of that to some degree. But like the historian Adam Tooze recently just gave a talk about the sort of world order system with Bretton Woods. And he mentions that, well, the first thing is that was an event in 1944, so it's not a post-war settlement. It's a during the war planning activity, if you like, for what the world would be about. There's a significant clash between the British Empire and America about that, which reflects the tussle for, I guess, financial dominion. Keynes was representing the British Empire's position. The British Empire desperately wanted to get back on its feet, with the support of John Curtin, if I just make a little bit of a reference to Albanese's recent speech. But it does sort of impose a financial system. But there's a struggle for quite a few years afterwards about how Bretton Woods would actually be implemented. All the empires were sort of imposing, all the old European empires were sort of imposing sort of trade and currency restrictions within their economic zones. America asserted its power. There were sort of spending problems, and it ultimately leads up to 1971 and, going off the gold standard. So the stability of a lot of these assumed institutions of the post-war world order is when you actually look at the real history of it, is much less stable than it really was. So there is this, and what John Darwin says is there's sort of two undeclared empires in the world. One's the communist world, largely around the Soviet Union, and then there's the American empire as well. But that empire is, a lot of people deny it's an empire. America's a republic. There's no emperor, so how can it be an empire? But that empire worked in a very particular way, and one of those ways was the financial influence, but also just the astonishing economic dominance that America had in the 1950s in terms of industrial output and all that sort of thing, which also bought it, the military expansion, that also bought it the political influence, that also bought it the cultural influence around the world. But the base of that empire is just not there anymore. I mean, you just can't try to be the kind of colossus bestriding the world that you could be when you controlled, I can't remember the exact numbers, but 40% of the world's, 40-50% of the world's manufacturing, compared to today where you control like 10-15% of the world's manufacturing. It's just a whole different set of actual conditions. And I think the great challenge everyone's facing at the moment is how to adjust to America coming to terms with the fact that, it's not great in the way that it was in the post-war world. And it can never be like that again. It's just, to be like that again can only be a form of reasserting a quite brutal imperialism that simply, relies on keeping other countries down, stopping other countries developing, preventing other countries taking care of their own sort of regional security and defence, stopping other countries, forming natural trading and cultural and security relationships with each other, like Japan and Korea and China, because they're all sort of, adjacent to each other and connected to each other in all sorts of historical ways. And just constantly imposing America into this sort of situation is just, it's an impossible sort of dream of world dominance, which I guess in a way harks back to Alfred Mackinder, who you mentioned before. So I kind of drifted a bit there, Joel. I'm not sure if I fully answered your question.
No, I'm very happy to be drifting. There's plenty of drift leeway here in this conversation because of the nature of it.
You just reminded me of a thought, because you were asking about the Westphalian and concert of Europe and all that sort of thing. And in a way, like they are very European versions of world. I mean, the European versions of history, European versions or Euro-Atlantic versions of history, Euro-Atlantic versions of models of international relations. The Westphalian system that was set up, I think it was 1648, after the 30 Years' War in Europe didn't even involve Russia, for example. So it's not much of a world order if the largest country in Europe is actually not part of that particular world order. The concert of Europe is a different thing, but that concert of Europe sort of creates the conditions for, relative security within Europe, and indeed what the historian John Darwin describes as Greater Europe, which is North America, Europe proper, and the Russian Empire, which of course extends through the 19th century all the way, well, before the 19th century, all the way to the Pacific. It creates the conditions for overseas expansion of those empires. So the actual models of economic or of international relations, my reading of the history is they're often oversimplified versions based on these sort of European diplomatic events that actually are not looking at the broader sort of global situation between powers. And the really crucial sort of moment is really the early 19th century, or late 18th, early 19th century, where there's just the explosion of the Euro-Atlantic sort of powers related to the Industrial Revolution, but also related to Britain capturing India, and India at this point is the sort of one of the workshops of the world. So it's the East India Company and all that sort of stuff is a very significant geopolitical event that is very fundamental to sort of reshaping the sort of global order.
Sorry, Jeff. You said that, and I just want to chuck this in. Like, was the Congress of Vienna or the Concert of Europe, was that really just preparing the ground for this massive empire explosion that came afterwards?
Well, I mean, what John Darwin says is, up to about 1750, 1780, there's a sort of a balance, an equilibrium across Eurasia, where the local Indian states are relatively powerful. China's very powerful. Iran's got its own sort of status and powers as well. The Ottoman Empire is also quite strong, and there's no the European colonization is absolutely occurring, and there's the Americas and that sort of thing, but it's not it hasn't if you like conquered Eurasia. It's not dominating Eurasia. It's got a bit of a fragile hold over Eurasia. But the series of events that happen in that period dramatically change things. And this is where history is often, retrospectively seems it's inevitable that this sort of thing happens. But the Napoleonic Wars, which are the preceding event to the Congress of Vienna, and so the main purpose of the Congress of Vienna is to, settle the peaceful relations between the states of Europe after, Napoleon's defeated, in 1812 to 1814, could have very easily turned out differently because, China, until really about 1800, is going through it's the sort of glorious years of the Qing Empire. There's certain things that happen within the 19th century in China that sort of upset that balance to some degree. But the relative power of the different countries around the world, it was not obvious that the West was going to, play out in that way. If there had been a renewal of the internal conflict within Europe between those countries that negotiated the settlement in the Congress of Vienna, then that would have substantially weakened Europe, it would have also drawn Britain into conflicts if there'd been, more resistance to Britain in India. Things would have also worked out differently. If there hadn't been famines and internal rebellions and stuff like that in China, then the European sort of entry into China would have been less successful. So there's this real contingency, I guess, that I guess the really good historians will bring to the story of the events that is not always there in, the sort of the international relations model of things where diplomatic geniuses worked out this stable state system in 1648 and in 1815, and then something went wrong, so all of a sudden. And look, America's part of that story too, because part of America's growth and expansion through the 19th century was due to the fact that the European powers sort of basically agreed to absent themselves from internal conflicts in North America, to not fight over North America in the way that they were fighting, for example, over India or
and that led to the Louisiana Purchase and all these sort of things that ended up happening in the aftermath as well, right? So was the Monroe Doctrine
America could grow undestroyed, and the Monroe Doctrine was
born out of that.
Born out of that, and whenever it was 1825, it was a bit more of a vain hope from America because
it was a puppy dog.
It was a puppy dog, but then it sort of had the wars with Mexico and got Texas and got California and there were all the sort of national wars of liberation in South America as well against the Spanish Empire, and so there's all these I guess dimensions to the story that we tend to sort of forget. But if we realize that they are there, we have a much more deeper appreciation of the fact that, it's never been a simple story of a hegemon and a challenger, as in the Thucydides Trap. It's never been a simple story of good versus evil. It's always been a story of multiple powers contending with each other and blending with each other, because the same's true of the internal development of the United States. It's a product of the Spanish Empire and the British Empire and the French Empire and the Native American empires and the transatlantic slave trade and all these sort of things sort of coming together and developing in a particular way through the 19th century. And then in a whole other way in the 20th century because of the consequences of World War I and World War II.
So Jeff, could we maybe say that the empires that aren't hiding and biting, so you see Russia and China right now essentially saying multipolarism is good for us. We want the multipolar world. But can you say that an empire reaches a certain, zenith in its empiredom, and then it becomes multipolar phobic, where it tries to start crushing multipolarism, crushing that sort of those multiple voices, or at least limiting them? And I want to sort of ask, is the UN a version of that now? Is the UN essentially a multipolar kind of institution that is about preserving, US primacy, essentially? Could the UN be an instrument to have the new Congress of the world or concert of the planet that's needed to sort of understand the new rules of multipolarism?
Look, I think it absolutely could. Like one of the people I spoke to on my channel, Richard Sakwa, wrote a book called The Lost Peace, which is how the West lost this, or lost the opportunity of peace after the first Cold War, leading into the events in Ukraine, etc. And he very much is an advocate of, the charter, the original UN Charter model of, national equal sovereignty between countries and acceptance of the diversity and of different political systems. And he says what's been countered to that, with increasing vehemence, really, since 1991, is the sort of liberal internationalist view of the rules-based international order, that there's one preferred model, liberal democracy, of how to run the world. Free market liberal democracy is the one preferred model to run the world, and the countries of that grouping have a higher claim, if you like, over how international relations should be conducted, and as a result have sort of undermined the laws for resolving differences between countries with different outlooks that is the aspiration of the United Nations. So I do think the United Nations does have the scope to, again, as people hoped, or at least some people hoped in 1945, but it will need to deal with the fact that America's never really, and to some degree the British Empire and its various dominions, including Australia, never really wanted the United Nations to fully be the way it hoped to be.
It's a toy village.
Yeah, a true village. And the historian Arnold Toynbee, who was like an eminent British historian, he wrote some impossibly long 12-volume history of the world. He was quite active in the sort of British foreign policy and security community in the 1940s and 1950s. And there's a history of the United Nations written by a guy called Mark Mazower, and it quotes Toynbee as saying that the plan was to turn the United Nations, in the context of expectations of a conflict with the Soviet Union, from its original charter vision to being what Toynbee described and this was like he described this in positive terms. He thought this was a good idea. An Anglo-American committee for the world,
Yeah, right.
So, and there's been a constant struggle in the context of decolonization, in the context of, the communist, capitalist sort of conflict of the Cold War, in the context of the unipolar moment, the Fukuyama end of history sort of stuff. There's been a constant struggle against the original vision of the United Nations, particularly by the USA. And within the USA, there's a real culture, especially amongst the sort of that sort of anti-state, libertarian sort of tradition in the United States, which is prevalent, across the political spectrum, and it's reflected in just the way they do things over there, which is pretty strange to most countries around the world. Like, they don't have a proper health system and all this sort of thing. But there's a real anti-state tradition that resents the idea of the United Nations as, world government. In fact, that Peter Thiel guy, the techno oligarch,
The maniac. Yep.
He was going on in this recent interview he did about just that, socialist world, someone, the United Nations or Greta Thunberg or someone wants to introduce socialist world government and tell the United States what to do. And
The tech native Greater United States or whatever that they're sort of looking at, right? There's those fans of the tech nate, those hyper accelerationists like Teal that are looking at this Canada, Mexico, Greenland kind of arc of land. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, yeah. It's a, it's, it's. I mean, it's a very. I just think it's a very destructive sort of ideology, but it's one that is not really getting is sort of getting exposed a bit, I guess. In like I've been following the whole how people interpret Trump, because there were all these people in the alternative media who were what I called Trump hopers, who sort of really believed that Trump was a peace president, and he was going to dismantle the deep state, and I don't know, all these kind of things. MAGA in America first didn't mean American expansion, America wins, all that sort of stuff. It means America prioritizes its domestic needs over its overseas, imperial needs, its endless wars. That they really believed that that was the case, and have been, slow to admit that everything that Trump does suggests that America first really did mean whatever happens, America's got to at least seem to win and be bigger and be more dominant and all that sort of thing. And if that means going to fight wars over people, then so be it. But I think their disappointment is starting to expose the fact that some of these sort of anti sort of state ideas in America are simply sort of unsustainable for them ultimately.
What you're sort of mentioning there, like there's a folly, by the sounds of it in the US, and it's the way it sort of perceives itself and projects itself currently. It feels like it's got a foot in two camps in that traditional kind of isolationist mentality that sees the UN and the International Court of Justice and things like this as pieces on a chessboard that can be sort of moved out of the way. And right now, there could be an argument made, like you see Elbridge Colby and a couple of these thinkers in the United States talking about the need to streamline America's outlook. These 800 bases have to come down. Now, if you were an empire preservationist in Washington that wanted to look at reanimating America in the multipolar world, making it more streamlined, making its blue water fleets more compatible with that kind of thing, and even if it was about being a horrible disrupting force, doing it smarter, doing it better, with less overheads, with less money just flowing out of this empire, is the current trajectory. And I'm talking about when an empire goes a little bit dumb or a little bit loses its intelligence, it starts harkening back to these shadows. It clutches at these past glories and these shadows that might they can reanimate and reheat in the microwave. So with Iran, we're seeing like this recitation of this kind of Iraq sort of model, and people are getting lazy and saying that what happened in Syria can happen in a 4,000-year-old civilization state that has, this size and power that, can't be compared within the region. Is there an ultimate, a hyper acceleration of demise that comes from this kind of thinking for Washington? And is there, are there people within the Pentagon, within the CIA, within decision-making set and the foreign policy class that are actually thinking like this and are going to try and make a more rational, realist America in the next, decade or so?
I think so, but I think one of the observations I'd make about how America is kind of functioning as a government at the moment is it's sort of not really functioning as a government. And it's not just because Trump's a bad guy or MAGA's evil or whatever. It's the fact that America has this very old political system that it's for a long time thought is the world's greatest political system, and there's no faults with it. The founders invented this beautiful system, and just keep it running like this. But it's also an incredibly fragmented and, if you like, almost privatized political system. So, just the way people get into office, like, it's a personal appointment of president. The ministers are not people who've are members of a cabinet, members of a parliament, all that sort of thing. The top bureaucrats are, patronage appointments, political patronage appointments. There's all these sort of think tanks and corporate board appointments where people are sort of parked in and sort of come in and out. And it means everyone's got a little fiefdom where they can keep their dreams of conquering Iran or conquering Russia or conquering China or, whatever it is going. And they have also a sort of a military security apparatus which enables that to some degree. I mean, the CIA is everywhere. It's got covert operations everywhere. No one is sort of there's someone nominally in charge of the CIA, but is it really? If you think what it's actually like to actually control an organisation that is got that much resources and that much sense of impunity, that much sense of omnipotence, and that a long tradition of operating outside the law. Political assassinations and all the rest of it. No one can really control that sort of thing. So I think what we're partly seeing is this confusing crowd of opinions where there might be some people like Elbridge Colby who have what seems like a rational plan to sequence, the strategy to sort of close off the operation in Ukraine and get Europe to pay for that, and then we'll sort of go over and fight China in Taiwan. But they can't actually close the operation in Ukraine. They can't, they think they can just bomb Iran, and I think there've been reports that Trump saw it as a case of, we'll go in, we'll bomb the hell out of them, and then we're out, and that's it. And that didn't work either. So all these grand
add
plans.
to that, they can't even appease Benjamin Netanyahu's coalition of madness.
Yeah. Well, and with the active collaboration of America, Israel's been attempting to eliminate Hamas for, I've forgotten how long it is now. How long is it? 18 months,
years.
2 years? Well, yeah, but specifically since October.
It's over 600, and I think we're heading up to about 650 days.
Yeah. So it's a combination of this sort of insane, excessive ambition and an apparatus that is out of control, and a sort of executive political class who are increasingly oriented to media performance rather than government, like functioning in government. Donald Trump is essentially a media performer. He's not a government. He's not a he's not a diplomat. He's not a politician. He's not someone who's led large, complex organisations through complex things. So, how is he going to sequence it? How is he going to get the CIA under control? He's not. All he's going to do is try to present an image of bravado, if you like, with the latest mishap and the latest, false step along the way. So I feel there might be people there, but I just can't see how they can um, uh, 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 succeed in actually curbing it in any way. And I think unless America sort of comes to terms with the fact that it just can't keep operating this. It's running an empire that is way beyond its resources and way beyond any, I mean, moral sort of justification, really. I mean, why are there American military bases scattered all through the West Pacific 80 years after World War II? Why are there American military bases occupying large parts of Europe 80 years after World War II? It becomes almost the institution serving itself, but once that's set into play, it's just so hard to sort of wind back. So I mean, I guess my 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 belief or prediction, but also my fear is that it's going to have to take some kind of high cost defeat of the US in one or more of these theatres of conflict for the realization to finally sink in America that we need to stop doing this. We need to reprioritize. We need to actually start to dissemble it. But I suspect it will be forced upon America rather than America choosing it, if you like. And it's something I say with a fair bit of trepidation because, especially with some of the people in charge, it's hard to know exactly how that might play out. What if America goes into a rage and decides to, drop a nuclear bomb on someone?
Well,
So
we saw Trump back out of the mid-range tactical nuclear treaty, and we're hearing news and threats of tactical nuclear weapons being used in Ukraine, in the Middle East, all sorts of things. We are entering a new sort of period in that sort of sense. You mentioning the CIA there, and I've spoken about it with a couple of my guests. And the power they have, the black budgets, the reach. And I wanted to sort of speak to, something quite interesting I came across that, within Iran itself, and the vitriol and the kind of bad blood that's going on with Iran, is probably generated from this moment where, essentially the CIA's operations in Asia were based out of Tehran, including one of the 4 mints in the US was based in Tehran. So they were printing $20 bills. The 4th location outside of the US was in Tehran to pay for all these
Really?
CIA operations. I got this through Professor Roy Casagranda, who did a fantastic talk about this. And, essentially, at this moment when the revolution happened, the blokes that were shredding the documents in the embassy were CIA staff, of course. And they famously were put back together by university students who then leaked these documents around and exposed all these CIA assets, essentially, destroying the cover of the CIA operations in all of Asia. And they had to rebuild again from the floor there. Now, there was a moment there where they came into contact with another established intelligence force, I think, Mossad, right? From that moment onwards, a neoconservative movement was really put into place. And leading up to Richard Pearl's clean break document, which really defined the wars of the global war on terror, it feels like the imprimatur, the remit of the CIA changed significantly after it sort of was collapsed in this period and rebuilt with the aid of Israel. Oh, we're here. We can help you sort of build things. And I often wonder if we see the trajectory towards Iran right now, it is a Tel Aviv kind of favored approach to the geopolitics in the region. And, we're seeing like a gateway, and I'm talking about Mackinder's world island theory now here too.
Mm.
The West has this world island theory. Israel has this need for like regional hegemony. Maybe one's leading the other around. Potentially Israel's leading the Washington decision makers into thinking, well, Iran is your backdoor entry to China. And if you can get through Iran and then get through Pakistan, right, the story is going to be told there. I want to ask you if there is a real kind of rational thought or idea going on in Washington that Iran, then Pakistan, then the collapse of China is actually a viable option. If what's going on right now in America's interest or perceived interest is around opening up that gateway to create the world island, are we always coming back to this like dumb idea in Washington, which is world island?
Look, I do think it is that, or at least there's a sentiment of domination and destruction and revenge, because I do think especially in Iran, with Iran, there is in America a culture of revenge against Iran because of 79 and the revolution and all that sort of thing. But I do think the whole world island thing is drawn into sort of rationalize and give a seeming sort of strategic coherence to all these sort of plans. And also, I mean, I guess to reflect, various geostrategic realities. I mean, people do talk about a plan for Greater Israel, for Israel to dominate that region, to eliminate conflicts, to cut off the sort of trade and communication routes between, well, I guess Iran, between Russia and India, China as a supplier of Iran as the supplier of oil to China as well. So there's some real reality to it as well. And I mean, I've just done a video on my channel. I forget the title for it, but it's something like America's Mad Failing 7-Point Plan to Dominate the World. And it refers to a comment that the Russian economist, strategic advisor Sergei Glaziev made, which is, America has this 5-stage plan to dominate, which is, install the pro-US regime in Ukraine, defeat Russia, conduct regime change in West Asia, including Syria and Iran, then go on to cut off Europe-Russia economic relationships by blowing up Nord Stream 2, and then also and then going into China and forcing regime change in China, but basically, cutting off its economic relations with the world through tariffs or whatever, which would force social instability into China and then force sort of regime change. And I think if you listen to the way Americans talk, there's absolutely a reason to think that is the case. And there are particular people who are advocates of particular things. So there's the Israel lobby, the anti-Iran lobby. There's the Russophobes who were very, very powerful under the Biden administration. The sort of we want to get revenge on Russia, and then there's the sort of take down the CCP crowd like Steve Bannon and to some degree Trump and a lot of even Marco Rubio and those kind of people. And the Mackinder, control the world island sort of theory is the sort of strategic core around it. And that theory is, I mean, that's taught in American military colleges. It becomes, it's the sort of doctrinal orthodoxy for sort of seeing the world. And it's reflected in, you know, there's squillions of geopolitics YouTube channels out there who sort of repeat the sort of Mackinder, you know, theory. It's also
Along
reflected
with
in,
Huntington as well, right?
yeah, and
The Clash of Civilizations, that is.
yeah, Huntington is in a way a sort of an adaptation of it in a way, you know, Huntington was almost like he was uh, his work was probably better than it's perhaps been interpreted, but it was basically a kind of, okay, we've won the Cold War. Uh, Now we have to find another reason to dominate the world, kind of thing. And it's, but in his case, he wanted to say, well, you know, maybe we ought to accept the fact that there are limits to our power, and some of those limits are defined by civilization. But it was also very much informed by a belief that sort of white Anglo-Saxon Protestant Western civilization was the best civilization, and that it had a rationale, I guess, for dominating others.
Almost
But the thing,
providential.
yeah, and this is the thing. I mean, there's a crusading element to American political culture, the universalism, the exceptionalism, the unilateralism. All of this is, you know, the right is on our side. We are the democracies. You know, we created the international rules-based order. We created, you know, everything. Uh, but the thing about Mackinder is, you know, his theory is based on this famous essay from 1904 called The Geographical Pivot of Asia, Pivot of History, sorry. So it's 1904. It's before World War One. It's before, you know, planes, the internet, radio, container shipping, satellites, blah, 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 blah. But in 1904, Halford Mackinder believed that he and you know, the academics of you know, Western Europe at that time had enough knowledge to know the fundamental laws of geography and history. And what his theory was just saying what these were. And if you read that essay, it's full of this, well, you know, quite frankly, you know, it's racist attitudes towards the, you know, the Asiatic nomads who have always come from the Eurasian steppe to attack Europe. And he actually closes the essay with a comment that if and he's speaking really as an agent of the British Empire at this point. The British Empire, you know, at that point is controlling, you know, roughly 25% of the world's territory, roughly 25% of the world's population. And when we say controlling, we're also meaning like India, and so cruelly exploiting. He says, if Britain is able to work with Japan to sort of move into China, then we're able to displace Russia as the temporary tenant of the heartland of the world. So the Russian Empire pre 1917, before the revolution, 1917 revolution, before the existence of the Soviet Union, the sort of grand strategist of the British Empire, who's become the grand, you know, the founding doctrine of American geopolitics, is basically basing his whole theory of geopolitics on effectively a kind of a hatred of Russia and a desire to say that somehow one country can just remove an entire you know, empire, group of cultures and civilizations from a place and treat it as the temporary tenant of this area, which is, I think it was at that point roughly 1/6 of the world's land area. So it is, and then the other thing about the world island theory of, he controls the heartland, by which he means Russia. He controls Eastern Europe, controls the heartland, by which he means effectively Russia and the dominant Eurasia. And he controls the heartland, controls the world island, Eurasia, and he controls the world island, controls the world. It's a statement of, it's like a Doctor Strangelove statement of mad ambition,
Vulcanesque or something,
and it's never been the case. There has never been someone who has controlled the world island.
Alexander the Great on steroids, with no reference, with no, it's just insane. I want to speak to you about this Russia sort of Britain thing. I've yet to meet many Brits at all that don't have this kind of like ingrained kind of thing about Russia. It goes back. I have to just ask, just in passing, is this all to do with the Afghanistan experience in the 1850s? Is that where that enmity was born, in that sort of great game period there between the spies, of Russia and Britain in Afghanistan? Is that where that enmity was born? Because it seemed like there was a stage where the Brits and the Russians were quite friendly between the two royal families. And it was leading up to a certain point, because that Russia phobia seems like after that, the loss of Afghanistan, Western mindsets have changed forever with regards to the world island. I mean, that's what ended up with that world island thesis, I suppose.
Yeah. Look, it's a bit of a mystery, but it's deep and pervasive. And I mean, I think to some degree also the British Empire and the Russian Empire were the two, if you like, the two outside, as in on the outside of the major European continental empires. And they were the two great rivals, if you like, and Russia was to some degree a major rival to Britain. And I guess that rivalry drove a lot of enmity. And it goes back, I think, before the Great Game, the so-called Great Game around Afghanistan. I mean, most historians of Russia say that, no one in Russia actually talked about the Great Game. That was it was kind of a fantasy of British diplomats, a little bit like, I don't know, it's sort of like the Russiagate hoax kind of thing.
Well, the romanticism with which the British, speak about that history and the players involved, you can tell straight away that it really was.
But it's just been repeated over. I mean, the way Waterloo, Russia defeats Napoleon in 1812 and then marches across Europe to liberate Europe from Napoleon's empire. And, Alexander the First, marches into Paris and is basically the liberator of Europe at that point. And but Britain claimed it did it all at Waterloo. And there's the Crimean War, and there's further conflicts. There's the interpretation of what went on in World War One. Again, World War One is, if you look at the World War One from the perspective of Russia and Central Europe, it's a very, very different story to what it is if you look at it from the perspective of kind of Britain and France. But during after the Russian Revolution, Britain was, its war cabinet was drawing up plans for how it could basically loot the resources of Russia, a little bit like perhaps they've been drawing up plans over the last few years after, with the conflict with Ukraine. And they were participants in the civil war. So Russia and the United States troops, even Australian troops, went in as combatants in the civil war in Russia, which was
Archangel, right? Or was it
yeah,
Archangel? Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
that's right. Yep.
Uh,
A guy across the street actually wrote a book about it. So
just an incredible like footage of like Aussies sitting on this snowy boat, just watching it all go down in the,
yeah,
it's just
yeah,
insane.
yeah.
To think about that.
It's sort of one of the original regime change wars, and
We've been involved in all of them, right? Every single one of them. That's just great to know. Yeah, like Australia, really, its track record now as a belligerent has been about regime changes around the world. We have been an interlocutor in regime change sort of arcs for a long
absolutely.
time. It's incredible.
And look, the Russia stuff was part of the thing that sort of got me into this whole business of Substack and YouTube, etc. Because it was towards the end of my time as a public servant, and I was sort of on my way out. And but over time, I studied a lot of Russian history. I've Russian literature. I've travelled to Russia, all that sort of stuff. I have a good sense of things, and I remember what the mood in the world was at the time of Gorbachev, and this great, opportunity to resolve the Cold War peacefully and with dignity and respect for both sides. And Gorbachev did, in fact, negotiate a peaceful end of the conflict and, argued for a kind of multipolarism at the UN in like 1988 back then. But the decisions of America were to basically kick the Soviet Union and Russia when it was down. And so that opportunity was lost, led to the collapse of the Soviet Union. And I went to Russia in 2003, and you could still feel the absolute pain and suffering and the trauma and the sort of sense of humiliation that people experience in the 1990s in Russia, the divinnosti, where life expectancy fell. It was just what's celebrated as some sort of liberal freedom or whatever in the West was a social tragedy in Russia.
From that Pizza Hut ad with Gorbachev
Yeah,
to Vladimir Putin, right? That was the period.
yeah. It's such a cartoon version of what happened.
And you had like blokes like Kordakovsky and all these things running around and like essentially
Yeah,
just drawing,
Khorovsky,
just draw
In
the
fact,
billionaire class.
I was in Russia when Khorovsky was arrested, and it was, I don't know, a couple of years after, or a year or two after. Do you remember Christopher Skase at all? The sort
Course
of
I do.
yeah,
Was he
yeah,
over in Cuba after Spain for a
yeah,
bit? Yeah, like so.
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. I mean, Hodorowski was kind of like the Christopher Skase of Russia, and he's now being, because he's a overseas billionaire. I hope he doesn't see this video, or he'll send some of his goons on me. But uh, he's created this reputation for himself as a nice democratic guy, but that's not what he was.
And Christopher
But
Skase put Mallorca on the map, mind you. I think.
yeah, that's right. And but skipping ahead to so when the Russia-Ukraine war in the latest phase of it in 2022 broke out, I was just deeply, deeply shocked at the way in which there was just this kind of war fever that took over, especially across the West, but deeply in Australia, and the closed-mindedness people had about the events, that the denial that there was any kind of different version of the story, and almost a bit of like I actually went and spoke to some of the local politicians and said, there's two sides to this story. you know, have a think about it. Um, and but they didn't want to know, and they were very much they were, if we have to bring the Russian economy to its knees, we're going to do it because we hate the Ruskies or something like that, without any consideration of, well, if, as Joe Biden said, we'll turn the ruble to rubble, or what does that mean for the suffering of those people in Russia, and on what possible basis do you think you're justified in doing that? And, is the story you're telling us about Ukraine really, really, really true? But it has been a thing about the Australian media that, has quite, and politics that I've noticed that it is like the ABC and the Murdoch press is just the Channel 9 press. So they're all very, and even the sort of, progressive side of politics just tend to accept the propaganda points really without even thinking
Yeah.
about what exactly they're standing for. And
The Hitlerization of Putin, the demonization of Russia as the bad guy. I even find with, say, Iran, with Israel, with looking at a lot of the bad guys, there's a lot of nuance in the press. Well, not a lot of nuance, but there's certain types of nuance with Russia, and that was exemplified by the entire parliament standing there with that Ukrainian flag from every single. I think there was just only a couple of independents that might have stayed out of that photo.
yeah.
It
No, I
was
think
just
they all stood.
they
They
all did.
absolutely all stood.
Incredible. It's an incredible
Yeah,
blanket support for something that has a lot of nuances and complexities, as you
yeah,
explain. And given a little bit of just a little bit of focus on that region and the lead up from Minsk, what
yeah.
came before, kind of period of history.
Mm.
And sort of incredible how it has been sort of completely blanket in that space. The bad guy factor. I wanted to sort of ask you about, we're seeing these emerging flashpoints outside of these sort of major conflicts that are, in the works in Ukraine, in the Middle East, and potentially with China. We're seeing what happened with countries in the Sahel, Burkina Faso and Mali. Then we're also seeing like a response to multipolarism in places like the Congo, where the US has come in and cut these big deals with the government, essentially looking to transform the whole makeup of that region. And this is echoing out, in other little, spot fires, I suppose you can call them, around the world. Do you think that there's kind of, what will be the key flashpoints of multipolarism in your opinion? Even looking at, say, Azerbaijan and Armenia and things like this, what are going to be the key flashpoints of this emerging, inevitable situation?
Well, I think there's certainly one that is on the economic front, and I guess that's been fought out at the moment around the Trump, the tariffs and all that sort of stuff, and that doesn't quite seem to be going to plan from the American point of view. Uh, uh, but I guess So I think I guess there's the military sort of front, and then there's the economic front. But the economic front, I guess, is particularly important for Australia, and Australia's really got to think about, how it manages that. And it does also, I mean, there are signals from Japan and South Korea, particularly in terms of the more closely integrated US allies, that they are stepping back from the more aggressive combined economic and military push of the United States towards, absolute dominance. So I think the whole trade relationship and our connections with the sort of East Asian countries is absolutely one of those flashpoints, and is really, really critical to it. So I really think it's important that Australia, um, uh, uh, you know, both protect its interests, protect a multilateral trade system, but also perhaps be a little bit more uh, forceful, I guess, maybe somehow in aligning with a multilateral, multipolar sort of direction to world trade, because that's the way it is. So I think that the economic conflicts are very much part of it, and that that's not just like the trade system is different to the overall different American political system. It's absolutely fundamental to the I guess the grand strategy of dominance. I think the West Asia issues are very significant as well. And I do wonder at times whether the US is sort of kind of given up on its plan to dominate Russia and Eastern Europe, and has said, well, at least if we control West Asia, we'll control the oil. So I think I'd be quite worried about more conflict in that area. And to date, I guess Australia has been pretty pusillanimous, to use a not very Bogan word.
We welcome all words here, Jeff.
Lily-livered, pathetic, cowardly, in relationship to the series of events there. Like we were active participants in Prosperity Guardian. There's the whole, the Gaza genocide issue. There's Iran, and Australia says, yeah, sure, bomb Iranian nuclear facilities.
We're commanding a Red Sea task force, I hear, as well, in the ocean. How the hell did that happen with 6 guys and no boats? But we're doing it because they shoehorn us into anything they can to have us complicit in these acts.
But I also think South Asia is really important, and I feel it probably doesn't get as much attention as it should in the Australian media or a lot of the alternative media, which tends to be kind of, America, China, Europe sort of focused. But I think the issues around South Asia are very, very significant. I mean, the conflict that occurred, a month or 2 ago with Operation Sindoor with Pakistan, my expectation would be there'd be another round of that.
The powder keg aspect there is incredible, right? Like we're looking at ideologically kind of charged up populations. We're looking at opportunism as well there, right?
Yep. And I think there's I follow Indian media to some degree, and I think there is a strong view there in India that they have made a very strong statement with Operation Sindoor that they're just simply not going to tolerate sort of sponsorship of terrorist activities, and that they also wanted to get over an image that India's a sort of soft touch, so to speak, in crude terms, but that
Their Rafale jets. Their Rafale jets might conflict with that narrative a little bit, the exchange.
Well, and this is the other interesting aspect of it, because it also involves China, and so I mean there is a complex relationship between India and China. There are quite different versions of the events, and the relative success of the parties, from Indian-based media, Pakistani-based media, Chinese-based media, so I mean, I think the Indian general has spoken recently today about the Rafale jets, but then people also talk about the BrahMos missiles and the impact on the Pakistani nuclear facilities and the overall impact of the Indian operation forcing Pakistan into suing for peace very quickly. So, and I'm no military analyst, so I can't really judge it. But I guess what I'm saying is I guess some different strategic calculus going on at the moment in India, and part of their strategic calculus around Pakistan is also around the role that both the US and China is playing in Pakistan. And some of the trade tensions between India and China as well. And although there's been a lot of effort from both India and China to ease tensions since 2020, and some success in that, there's also some very very significant tensions as well. So just the complexity of that situation, I think, does lend itself to a potential for things to go wrong. And of course, there was the whole Bangladesh situation, which is also not an entirely stable situation. There's issues in Myanmar and things like that as well. So I think South Asia is something I think in Australia we probably ought to pay a lot more attention to. And in a way, I also feel in many ways we could perhaps emulate India's approach to foreign policy, which is, I think they talk about multi-alignment rather than non-alignment. It's sort of multi-alignment. I don't see why Australia ultimately can't adopt a position where it has strong relationships with the US on certain things, it has strong relationships with China on certain things, it has strong relationships with India on certain things and with Indonesia on certain things, but is not locked in behind any single one of those players, and I think ultimately that would be kind of better for Australia and better for the region, if you like, as well, because Australia is presumably, if Australia were a little bit less gung-ho on supporting American supremacism in the region, I think the region would be a lot more stable and a lot more secure and a lot more confident that it could develop prosperously and, in a way that suits all the peoples of the region.
Totally. I was speaking to Dr. Charles Knight about this. I don't know if you've come across him before, but, he was bringing up the island of Melios in Greece as an example of how, more in line with the Graham Allison's thesis, that we have to pick a side. That, Melios decided not to pick a side and it was swallowed up. To which I say to him, Melios wasn't an island continent nation at the bottom of the earth, with no geographical comparison whatsoever. And also, we are in a peaceful and dynamic region in Asia, one of the furthest away located from that kind of way of northern hemispheric kind of way of thinking. So I do want to ask you, just coming home, and I would love to get you back to, Jeff, to maybe have a deep dive into the multipolarism of Southeast Asia, of the Indo-Pacific, because this is just a very riveting conversation, and I think everyone's going to get a lot out of it. I did want to speak about Australia's kind of role and how it can fit into this brave new world that's appearing. I spoke about how empires in decline may be prone to try and crush multipolarism, try and limit this movement from happening. So how can small states like Australia survive in a multipolar world? And I'm talking about our geographic sort of scenarios with regards to supply chains, and this island girt by sea that would present its own challenges if the Malacca Straits was captured by a belligerent or something like that. So how does Australia navigate potential disruption from Beijing and Washington, as they flex their muscles against, potential multipolarism?
Oh, good question. Look, I think I feel in a way Sam Roggeveen with his echidna strategy has given us a pretty good answer on the defence side of things. So, we use our distance to our advantage. We protect our coast. We deny entry to our region, so to speak, and use the fact that China's a bloody long way away, and there's quite a few countries between it and us, so we don't have too much to fear about that. Perhaps we should put a little bit more attention to all the American troops who seem to be, and other agents, let's say, who seem to be operating within Australian soil. So I feel that there's a good answer on the security front. And I spoke to Gareth Evans, the former foreign minister, on my channel a while ago, and he talks about a few different principles, but one of them is more Asia and less America in our relationship. I mean, in practical terms, I guess we're locked into a lot of things with the United States. So any government has got to proceed cautiously and, not I'd love it if tomorrow there was a brave prime minister who could throw out Pine Gap and all that sort of stuff, and generally follow India's model of multi-alignment. But that would take quite a brave prime minister. But I do feel we should move towards that sort of Indian model of multi-alignment. But it might also be, and I also just think we need to recognise that I think the big international trend or challenge over the next 20 years or so will be the kind of American withdrawal from its empire. And I think we ought to be a constructive player in facilitating America doing that in a way that is ultimately, good for America and good for the world. I mean, I'd almost compare it to post-1945 decolonisation, because it is actually a form of decolonisation, really, that probably needs to happen. America doesn't need to have all these bases around the world. It doesn't need to be trying to control the regimes of 120 countries around the world. It doesn't need to have, covert operations in however many countries it has around the world. It doesn't need to, be number one on whatever index Donald Trump is thinking of that morning. So I feel Australia can play a positive role in doing that, and it has great resources for doing that, because one of the great successes of Australia, I think, in terms of social policy and government, like sort of democratic successes, one of the great achievements of Australia is it has its flaws, but it's a pretty successful multicultural society. Like there's a Russian who lives across the street, Taiwanese, Chinese, it's a Serbian woman over there, sort of thing. And that's just in our bones, so to speak. And I just feel if we applied that a little bit more to the international stage and just sort of slowly eased back from the excessive military commitments like AUKUS and the excessive diplomatic commitments like this sort of slavish devotion to the rules-based international order, and started to, if you like, maybe even use the example, the sort of move in the wake of India's rise, so to speak, to follow its diplomatic model of multi-alignment, to say, well, we don't have to choose between China and the US. Maybe we'll sort of do more what India's doing. And, the United States, that you're great friends with India, even though it's not a military ally with you and it doesn't have bases in, it doesn't have US bases in its soil. So, we'd like to be a bit like that too. It's not that threatening. I mean, we're only 25 million people. They're 1.4 billion people. If you can live with a country that is 1.4 billion people and is pursuing a policy of multi-alignment, surely you can live with a country of 25 million that's also pursuing a policy of multi-alignment. But I think we need to do that in a way that is confident and assertive and deals with the American fears, but is not too hung up on the American fears, because ultimately it's America's political culture is going to have to deal with the fact that they've just, they just cannot continue to perform this role in the world. It's destructive for their own society. But I think the world needs to sort of talk back a little bit more confidently to America to say, I mean, it's been good for 80 years, but we're all moving on from that now, folks. So,
Well, Jeff, I hope that it'll take a little bit more than, pretty much hitting rock bottom for our leaders to sort of, start prioritizing the national interest and,
yeah,
engaging with this incredibly dynamic, peaceful region that we're kind of living in. We have a lot of aces up our sleeves, both geographically, regionally. I've got just want to put a shout out to the Burning Archive, which is your Substack. You're also found on YouTube and all the podcast outlets. Is there any other promotions that you'd like to speak of at the moment?
Well, absolutely check out my Substack. And I'll just mention, there you go. I'm not doing a very good job of self-promotion, but if you go to my Substack, you can also find out about my books. I wrote a book called 13 Ways of Looking at a Bureaucrat, which sort of collected my various writings on what it's really like to be inside government, and which I published after I left government, because, of course, you're not allowed to say these kind of things when you're in government. So yeah, do check out jeffrich.substack.com. That's where my Substack and my writing is, and the Burning Archive YouTube channel. And, I post a couple of times a week on those and, talk about all sorts of issues.
And someone who's probably getting more of an international following. Jeff's very popular in the history world around the planet, and another example of a great export that's admired and appreciated overseas, but not so much in this ideological terra nullius that we live in here. So always good to promote someone like Jeff, and go check out his work. Thank you so much for coming, Jeff, and I hope we could catch up again soon in the future.
Absolutely, that'd be great, Joel.
Appreciate it.